I love the Gospel of John. I love the prologue, which some people find difficult.
I love at Christmas time, if I'm given the opportunity, as I often am, to read what's called the Prologue of John, the first 14 verses.
And I love it in the King James Version. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehendeth it not. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us.
So he steps back and has a sort of almost eternal perspective on the very ordinary events of the gospel.
And yet, despite this philosophical beginning, John gives you longer conversations with individuals than any other gospel. One of my favourites is the meeting with the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus asks her for a drink. You didn't ask women, strange women, for drinks. You probably still don't ask strange women for drinks in Palestine or Israel if there are people who still get water out of wells. It's not done, and Jesus does it. He crosses a boundary.
The Gospel of John is the fourth book in the New Testament. It's the fourth Gospel, and it shares some similarities with the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It talks about the feeding of the 5,000, the resurrection of Jesus, Peter denying Jesus, but at the same time it's the most distinct from the other three.
Yeah, the Gospel of John is, for every reader of the four Gospels, clearly different. So you get from the beginning understanding the first three are very similar. You have the same stories in different form. And John, you enter in a way a different world. The style how Jesus talks in John is so different from how he talks in Matthew, Mark and Luke that you get the feeling, how is it possible that this is the same person? And this was, of course, not a detection only in the 19th or 20th century, but already in the 2nd century, church fathers discussed this problem and said, yeah, John is the most elaborated gospel. It's the most spiritual one.
Well, when you see it depicted in art, the Gospel of John, or like in stained glass windows or in frescoes, the Gospel of John is depicted as an eagle, because theologically he sort of soars above the others. He's just this really rich gospel.
Some people would say he's different because he majors on the Jerusalem part of the Gospels, whereas the other Gospels tend to stress Galilee, which is geographically to the north. He's much more interested in discourses. I mean, it's wonderfully structured. After the prologue, you have the 7 signs, the miracle at Cana, the healing of the man born blind, the raising of Lazarus.
The marriage at Cana. Everybody loves the marriage at Cana because it's a wedding and because Jesus turns water into wine. And it's not just wine, it's wine of the very best quality.
Australian wine.
Australian wine is very good. It could be Australian wine, it could be French wine. It may be complex, but it will also have all the qualities of Australian wine. Its richness, its depth, its fruity quality.
Okay. So we're talking about some.
Sorry, I got carried away on the wine.
Yeah.
So John 2 is the story, the miracle of Jesus turning water into wine. John 2 verse 1, on the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and that's where we're standing, looking directly at Cana of Galilee, that mound over there. And the mother of Jesus was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. And then you know the next bit, there's no wine left. Jesus' mother persuades him to do this first miracle, even though he says he's not ready, which is to turn water into wine. You know that bit. And then we come to the end, and then it says, John chapter 2 verse 11, Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed this.
So we're here in Jerusalem at the pool of Bethsaida, or Bethzatha, which is one of the most important sites for the Gospel of John. It's the pool where Jesus is said to have performed a healing miracle. There was a man here who was lame, and Jesus comes across him, and I'll read you the story in John. There was a man there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been there a long time in that condition, he said to him, "Do you wish to get well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your pallet and walk." Immediately the man became well and picked up his pallet and began to walk. It's also important for John's Gospel because for many years scholars didn't know where this pool was, and it's thought that John's Gospel was less historically reliable than the other three synoptic Gospels. And in recent times, this site was found, which may well be the site which is the pool which has the 5 porticos. They're not here now, but it's thought that the 2 pools which are here, both about the size of a football pitch, fit well archaeologically with the information we have in John's Gospel.
Resurrection of Lazarus. There's a character with whom Jesus is good friends, and he's told he's sick. His name is Lazarus. He's sick, so Jesus waits a little bit, and then he shows up eventually, and they're like, he's dead. We've already put him in the tomb. And in the King James Version, you have this phrase, "Surely Jesus, he stinketh." So you've got this great, just this great old phrase, and you get the shortest verse in this section that's in the Bible, and it just says, Jesus wept when he hears about Lazarus having died. And so he goes to the tomb and says, Lazarus, come out. And then you have this scene of Lazarus being raised from the dead.
So there's an interesting miracle in John's Gospel where Jesus has been teaching in the temple, and then as he's coming out of the temple, he meets a blind man. And in most of Jesus' miracles that we read about, he heals by the power of the word. So he sort of says something, some sort of command maybe, and the man, or whoever it is healed. Now in this case, in the case of a blind man he meets on the way from the temple in John 9, Jesus does something a bit different. What he does, John 9 verse 4, he spits on the ground, and Jesus makes muds with the saliva that he's just spat onto the floor. And it says, then he anointed the man's eye with the mud and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. So he went and washed. And we're just by the pool of Siloam, so that's where we're going to head next. So this pool of Siloam. So once Jesus had rubbed the mud in his eyes, spat on the ground, rubbed the mud in his eyes, this guy, according to John 9, came down here to this pool, washed the mud off, and that was the miracle. He could then see.
And then after the book of signs comes what's called the book of the Passion, which is all preparing for the work of Christ on the cross and his suffering and the days before he goes to Calvary.
John is also, may have the most commonly heard verse or quoted verse today, John 3:16. John 3:16 is the verse that says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, and whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. And so it's this really commonly quoted text.
Why is that one so big?
It's sort of viewed as the central understanding of Christian gospel, and it's just that who is Jesus? Well, he's the Son of God. He's the only one who's born of God truly, and it explains what his mission was. So it's just the most, I guess, the most compact version of the gospel. So that's why it gained popularity.
John is, with regards to the words of Jesus, you get the impression this is highly redacted by the evangelist. But on the other hand, you have in John elements which you don't find in the synoptics, which are much more historically likely. So for example, that we have in John this mentioning that Jesus was in Jerusalem during 3 Passover festivals and not just one. In the synoptics you get the impression Jesus made a quick career in Galilee, 3 months, comes once to Jerusalem and was immediately arrested and get killed. And you get a feeling, oh, this is not very likely. In John it's clear he was in Jerusalem at least 3 or 4 times before he got arrested. So in a way John allows the Jerusalemites to get an understanding of Jesus and to realize that he might be dangerous or why he is dangerous.
John is also distinct in that it features more of the disciples than just Peter is sort of the main guy in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In John instead, he talks about Philip and Andrew, and also Thomas, who is a key figure because it's from this text that we get the phrase, a doubting Thomas. Towards the end of the gospel, Jesus has appeared to the disciples, but Thomas wasn't there. And so Thomas says, I won't believe it unless I see Jesus myself. And so later, Jesus reappears and says, why do you doubt?
John according to the tradition of the early church, is of course the disciple John, the son of Zebedee and brother of James. And he's then identified with the disciple who Jesus loved, which is mentioned in special occasions in the Gospel of John. But we have very early also a second tradition that there's an elder John already in this, the letters of John. And this elder John seemed to be different from the apostle John.
Okay, so I'm in the Sea of Galilee, up to my knees almost, but the site behind me is a traditional site given for one of the resurrection appearances of Jesus in John's Gospel. And in this particular story, Jesus died and the disciples almost don't know what to do next. So some of them have been fishermen before they're called, we read that in the Gospels, and they decide to go out fishing again. And that night they don't catch anything. The next day, or the next morning, they see a figure on the beach. And this figure calls to them and says, at this point the disciples don't know it's Jesus. He says, so John 21 verse 5, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" And they answered him, "No." So you can imagine that the disciples on their boat are fairly close to the shore here, because Jesus, on the beach, he's calling to them. He can speak to them, they can have a conversation. But at this point, they don't know it's him. So he says to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they throw this net out the other side, and the haul that they pull in is amazing, a massive haul. All of a sudden, it says in verse 7, the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." So suddenly they recognise, after this miracle of this haul of fish, they recognise that it's the Lord standing on the beach. And it's at this point that Simon Peter, this kind of rash, perhaps impulsive disciple, as we come to see in the Gospels, jumps into the water. First of all, it says he puts on a garment, implying that he was naked, perhaps for the process of fishing. He puts on his garment to be sort of decent before Jesus, swims. And it says in John 21 that it was about 100 yards. I've just thrown a stone, and I reckon I can get it about 30 metres, so about 3 of my stone's throws, but remembering that Jesus can hear them from the boat and vice versa. So Peter swims that distance, swims onto the shore here, and then this site commemorates this place. So it says that Jesus has lit a fire on the shore, so just behind me here, and he's cooked some breakfast, if you like, for them. And the importance of what comes next is that the story is a reversal of what happens The importance of what happens next is that the story is a reversal of Peter's denial of Jesus. So you know the story of the cock crowing 3 times and Peter denying Jesus 3 times. But at this breakfast scene, at this appearance of Jesus on the beach, Jesus says to Peter 3 times, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter answers, "Of course I do." And Jesus, this is obviously the right answer, Peter's witnessed the raised Jesus. And Jesus then says to Peter, "Okay, feed my flock." So in a sense, this is Jesus giving Peter the authority to be the leader of his church. And this church here, this building, is called the Primacy of Peter. So the idea, Peter, of the first leader of the church, if you like.
The ending of John's Gospel is very interesting because it's a kind of breakfast beside the shore. Again, it's a meal. It links back to the sacramental, to the life of the church. And at this meal, Jesus gives the church into the hands of Peter. "Feed my sheep, feed my lambs." And then the figure of John, the beloved disciple, who may be the author of the Gospel, comes up, and Peter says, "What's going to happen to him?" And Jesus says, "It's not for you to know." And then there is this wonderful phrase that if all the things that Jesus did were to be written down, the world itself could not contain the books that could be written. So you get this sense that the story of Jesus could go on and on and on and on.